are joining from that group, it's kind of a repetition of what I did for that group too. So it may be a review for some of you. I have to acknowledge the help and work of my colleagues, which I've listed them here. So what we will do for today, we're going to go over a background. We're going to do a quick summary of conventional and multi-frequency tympanometry, because that will serve as a basic for the more advanced assessment of the middle ear wideband acoustic immittance. We're going to talk about some practical issues and talk about wideband acoustic immittance in newborns and children, and then move to adults, and then cover cases and talk about some future direction, and hopefully we will have time to take some questions. So the frequency range that has been used traditionally to test the middle ear has been changed significantly over time. Typically, what we do in the clinic when you test the hearing, you test the hearing between 250 to 8,000 hertz. This is called conventional frequencies for hearing assessment, although there is a good push and a good evidence to test the hearing all the way to 16 kilohertz. But this is the most typical range of frequencies that are being tested. However, when you do tympanometry, this is the frequency of just one glimpse at the very low frequencies that has been used most widely across the globe to test the middle ear. There has been some changes, especially with newborns, to switch the frequency to 1K, but it's still a single frequencies. And middle ear is just not one frequency transmission line. It can actually transmit very efficiently a wider range of frequency. However, we are insisting of testing the middle ear at the single frequencies, which is not correct. Even when we do test the hearing, although it's narrow in range, but it's much wider than how we test the middle ear. So wideband acoustic immittance or wideband tympanometry, WBT test, essentially at the same range as you would do your traditional hearing assessment. I'm going to come back and talk about all these aspects as we go along in my lecture. So when we test infants, we notice that the 226 is not a good probe tone frequency to use. And because the pattern emerges at 226, whether you have an abnormal middle ear or normal, doesn't actually decipher or actually distinguish the two from each other. That's why now it has become standard of care to use 1K probe tone in babies, roughly around the time of birth to 3 to 6 months of age, depending on the protocol in each region and country. However, when you use the wideband acoustic immittance or wideband tympanometry, it provides a much better prediction of middle ear. It goes all the way to from 226 to around 8,000 hertz. I mean, the system can actually go much higher than that. In the research version, some custom-made devices of multi-frequency tympanometry. It's a brief reminder, and then we're going to go to the main topic, which is wideband acoustic immittance or wideband tympanometry. So as you know, the terminology that has been used in this context is called immittance, that refers to flow of energy. There are two ways to describe the flow of energy. You can describe how hard it is for energy to flow in the system, or the total opposition that you would get to the flow of energy. This is called impedance. Or you can talk about how easy it is for the energy to flow into the system. And it's called admittance. They are very similar in a way that you have a half a glass full of water. You can say half a glass is full of water, or you can say half the glass is empty. So it depends which perspective you're going to look at it. So this is a polar plot, and you can see that the admittance, which is the most commonly measured parameter in most commercially available machine, is a complex number. What I mean by complex number is a quantity that you would need magnitude as well as direction, in this case, a phase angle. So admittance, which is represented as the diameter of this rectangle, is comprised of two components. One is called susceptance, and susceptance is one of the susceptance due to stiffness, and one of the susceptance is due to mass. And the total outcome of these two is called total susceptance. And one aspect of the admittance, or one component of admittance, is called conductance. So in order to describe admittance, you either need to represent admittance in its total susceptance and conductance, which is called rectangular component, or you have to put forward the magnitude as well as phase angle. However, in most clinical settings, only the magnitude is going to be represented, which is kind of doesn't make much of a mathematical error at low frequency, but makes a huge mathematical error at the higher frequencies if you try to add or subtract admittance using a simple mathematical approach, because this you cannot add or subtract from another admittance. You have to subtract the component and then transfer them into admittance. But typically, this is what is being done in the clinic. You add or subtract admittance to save the peak from the tail. But at 226, the error is small. So these are the most typical parameters that is being used in the clinic to measure admittance. So I'd like the audience to make sure that their audio is off, because sometimes the background noise in the audio could actually make the interruption. So the parameters that are most commonly used in conventional frequencies are static admittance, or YTM. Basically, we are interested to measure admittance at the level of the eardrum. However, what we measure is at the level of the probe. So that's why we subtract the peak that represents the ear canal and middle ear from the tail that represents the ear canal. And the outcome is called static admittance, or YTM. Tympanometric shapes is the way that the tympanogram is going to look like. Jaeger and Feldman attempted to classify the tympanometric shape like A, B, C, and D. Feldman classification system was more robust and detailed, but it was never actually used. But Jaeger classification system, which was very simplistic, was adopted by most clinicians. Tympanometric peak pressure, or TPP, represent the peak of the tympanogram pressure, and often this one was assigned to middle ear pressure, which is a rough estimate. It's not the true estimate of the middle ear pressure. Ear canal volume is the estimate that you get from the either positive tail or negative tail. Those two values are different, so you have to be careful which normative data you're using. Same thing with the static admittance. You're subtracting the peak from the tail, or it says positive or negative. And also tympanometric width, which is the sharpness of the peak. So if the peak is very sharp or narrow, for example, if the peak is very, very sharp, it could be an indication of early stage of otosclerosis, or if the peak is very wide, it could be early emergence of otitis media. So here is a representation of those parameters on a tympanogram. So this is an uncompensated tympanogram Y at 226 Hertz. So this peak represents the ear canal volume plus the middle ear, and the tail represents the ear canal. So subtracting the peak from the tail will give you YTM. The pressure corresponding to the peak is called TPP. And the volume of the canal is measured from the positive or negative tail, and these two values are different. And the shape is called type A, based on Jaeger classification system. And tympanometric width is actually the width of this. So first you measure YTM divided by 2, you will come from the peak. That's going to intersect the two sides of tympanogram, and the pressure interval is going to be tympanometric width. Later on, around 75, Van Eyze, which actually had nothing to do with tympanometry, but was a head of a lab, and some of the colleagues in that lab were Cretin and Van Camp. They came to him during the lunch and showed him a complex pattern that would have been emerged from using a higher proton frequency of 678 hertz. And they were asking him how they can actually classify that, and he suggested to use the number of the peak and trough on susceptance and conductance to do the classification system, and they named it after him, Van Eyze pattern. So similar to the Jerger classification system, Van Eyze pattern is being used to classify the pattern that is emerging at the higher proton frequencies. Other parameters that you can use at the higher proton frequencies called resonant frequency, which is a frequency corresponding to the frequency of the middle ear that is very easy for energy to get transferred to the middle ear system.
Professor Nanvid, can you increase the volume of your mic a little bit, please, or just come closer?
Actually, my mic is on my mouth, so I just increased the volume a bit.
Yeah, now it's perfect, Professor.
Okay.
This is perfect. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. Resonant frequency, the frequency that is very easy for energy to transfer in the middle ear system because susceptance due to mass and stiffness cancel each other, and only conductance is contributing to the admittance. There's also another parameter, frequency corresponding to admittance phase angle, never caught up, but it's basically when your total susceptance is equal to conductance. And you can also measure a static admittance at multiple proton frequencies, similar to what you did at low frequency, but you cannot subtract the peak from the tail. You have to do that on susceptance and conductance, and then use a Pythagorean theorem to actually transfer them to the admittance, because there's going to be a huge mathematical error if you subtract the peak and tail on admittance. Basically, these are the Van Eyze pattern. So as you can see, these are susceptance tympanogram and conductance tympanogram, because there is only one peak on B, one peak on G. It's called 1B, 1G tympanogram. If you have this tympanogram at 678 hertz, the proton frequency that these patterns were actually classified was 678 hertz. So 1B, 1G pattern, because there's one peak on B and G. The system is stiffness dominated, and your phase angle is between 45-degree angle and 90-degree angle. The other pattern is called 3B, 1G, because you count the peak and trough, so 1, 2, and 3. So there are 3 peak and troughs on B and 1 on G. We later on subcategorize these patterns into 2, still 3B, 1G, depending on the depth of the notch. If the notch is above the tail, meaning that if you kind of draw a line here, it's going to be above the tail. It's not equal or below the tail. The system will be stiffness dominated, and system admittance is and phase angle is between 0 to 45 degrees. If the notch here on the 3B, 1G is at the tail or below the tail, the system is at resonance or mass dominated, and the phase angle is at 0 or below. So there could be 2 different type of 3B, 1G. One type, the notch is above the tail, system is not at resonance. And the other one, the notch is at the tail or below. What that means that the system is at resonance or below at the mass region. The other pattern is a 3B, 3G. So you have 3 peak and troughs on B and 3 peak and troughs on G. And this pattern is definitely a mass-dominated pattern, and the system phase angle is between 0 to -45. This is a very rare pattern that happens in the normal at 678 hertz, but so 5B, 3G, and the system is still mass-dominated, but the phase angle is between -45 to -90. As you can see with Van Eyze pattern, you're able to say if the system is a stiffness dominated or mass dominated at resonance or below resonance, above resonance, or also the phase angle estimate, which you cannot do with the Jaeger classification system. Here is the way that you measure the resonant frequency if you're using a B and G plot. So some commercial devices will provide this for you, like GSI or Matson TeamStar Pro, for example. I have a video for you that I'll show you shortly. And also the Matson had that feature. There's some Italian version in the past, I'm not sure at current, that used to offer these plotting scheme. I'll talk about the wideband acoustic immittance that also has that capability. So when you plot BNG, you keep changing the probe tone frequency until the notch on B becomes equal to the tail, and that becomes your resonant frequency. You can estimate the resonant frequency. And estimation of resonant frequency would depend whether you do it from positive tail or from the negative tail. So the normative data is different. So here is one of the machines that can actually do the conventional and multi-frequency tympanometry, which is called TeamStar Pro. Again, just a quick note, I'm not affiliated with any manufacturer and I have no conflict of interest. So when I bring a machine up, it's actually based on my experience of use that I have these machines in my lab, as well as teaching students using this machine and maths. And so we have different systems available. But this is specifically a very cool machine because it's using the same technology as Titan, wideband acoustic immittance. In the past, the version 2 of TeamStar was using a sweep frequency method, which was taking a bit longer, but this machine is using a short click, which is the same technology as the Titan to measure the resonant frequency. It's much faster, much user-friendly. You don't have to do multiple run. In one run, you get all the parameters that you would need. So here is a quick video that I did so that you know how the new generation can actually do all these things in a much faster and more efficient way. Okay. So here is the plot that you would get from the system. So as I mentioned in the video, this is called delta B, or compensated susceptance. So here the zero line. If your compensated susceptance is above zero, your system is stiffness dominated. Crossing zero is an indication of resonant frequency, and below zero is a mass dominating. So it's a right and left. And you get the numbers here for further assessment. So let's go to wideband tympanometry measure and wideband acoustic immittance. The general terminology that has been accepted is called wideband acoustic immittance. And under that big umbrella of wideband acoustic immittance, there is a wideband tympanometry. And the difference is that you can pressurize similar to tympanometry and do wideband acoustic immittance. So if you do that, it's called wideband tympanometry. Only one machine. There are two commercially available systems. I'll go and talk about it, but only one of them is capable of running it at static, means that there is no need to change the pressure. And one of them is capable of running it only at static pressure, and one of them at static and multiple pressure point. I'm going to talk about it. So this history of it goes back to Doug Keefe back in '93. There was another group, Jones Allen, and each of these two groups resulted in two different systems. But it took about 2 decades from establishment of a system to kind of commercialization of the idea to the point that it's available commercially right now for purchase. And it's the story of what we do in research and what will happen in the clinic. Even if you look at what has happened in acoustic emission, David Kemp did the first attempt for publication in 1979, which was rejected and later on published in another journal. But it took about 20 years to actually get the ball rolling in a screening programs. So there's a big gap between what we do in research and what we know is going to work to adaptation of that technique or assessment in the clinic by the clinicians. It provides a much more accurate measure of how the middle ear works compared to conventional multi-frequency tympanometry in all 3 population of babies, children, and adults. The frequency range can go up to 10 kilohertz and up to 20 kilohertz in custom-made system in labs. However, in commercial version, you can test anywhere between 250 and 8,000 hertz at the same time using a short click or chip, depending on the machine that you're using. David Kemp provided a very good timeline in our field from what we know that's working in the lab and adaptation of the same knowledge by conditions. That's a 10 years from first discovery, first article and patent to general acceptance among researchers, and another 10 to 15 years for clinician and commercial manufacturer to adopt that. So you can see a gap of 20 years. So what you see right now is a work that actually goes back all the way to 20 to 25 years ago. So it's much faster. It will take about 2 seconds if you do in static version. If you do in pressure version, it'll take a bit longer, but it's still very short, about 6 seconds or less. Again, depending on the system that you can use, you can run it at 1 pressure, which is called ambient pressure, or you can run it at multiple pressure. So unlike tympanometry, you don't need to change the pressure. It's a much wider frequency range. If you're using a conventional tympanometry, you're using 1 frequency, either 226 or 1K, depending on the population that you test. Even if you use a multi-frequency tympanometry, you're using 250 to 2000 hertz due to limitation of the system. But this one can go all the way from 250 to 8,000 hertz. And unlike tympanometry, it has the potential to predict the conductive hearing loss, which is not the case with tympanometry. Often you may have a very abnormal pattern, tympanogram, and then there is no conductive loss, or vice versa. You may have a normal tympanogram at conventional frequency, but there's significant or huge conductive hearing loss. So basically, the system is using a short click in one version of commercial device. And this is a short click. And this is a Fourier transform of this. You see a wide flat response across wide range of frequency. The limitation of the frequency range is based on the fidelity of the receiver that is being used and calibration issues. So the commercial machine can give you a very flat output anywhere from 250 hertz to 8,000 hertz using a short click. That's why it's very, very fast test. And the intensity is around 60 dB NHL, which is roughly 95 dB peak SPL. Just to give you an idea on pressure reflectance, and we're going to come and talk about terminology here, similar to what we did for tympanometry. Like in tympanometry, you can either say how easy it is for energy to go to the system, which is called admittance, or how hard it is for energy to flow into the system, which is called impedance. So we have different terminologies here, and then let me actually go over them so that it makes sense before going and talk about the patterns that could emerge in different pathologies. So energy reflectance is a ratio of reflected energy over incident energy. So what that means, if I send a known energy in this arrow, okay, it's called incident energy, some of it will go into the system and some of it are reflected back. So some will go in, hopefully we would like most of it goes in and goes into the cochlea, but as you know, the system is not 100% efficient at different frequency, but so some is getting reflected back. If I take this ratio of reflected part of the energy to incident energy, I get what we call energy reflectance. And that energy reflectance varies between 0 to 1. So what that 0 and 1 means. So if I send the incident energy in, and all of it is reflected back, then the ratio becomes 1. So nothing goes in. So that's the extreme, right? So known energy goes in, nothing goes into the middle ear system, everything is reflected back, and then I take the ratio of this red over blue, and then the ratio becomes 1. And what that means that nothing has been transferred into the middle ear system and into the cochlea. So this is called hell because nothing goes in, right? The other extreme is that when I send the energy in and all of it goes toward the middle ear and to the cochlea. So if I take there is no reflected energy, so the ratio becomes 0. So that is the heaven because we love for all energy to go into the cochlea and the middle ear. So these are the two extremes. So the maximum and minimum 0 to 1 in energy reflectance. However, most researchers have agreed upon to present this in absorbance, which is similar to admittance in a way, because when you talk about impedance, you talk about how hard it is for energy to flow in the system. When you talk about admittance, you talk about how easy it is for energy to transfer the system. So we take the absorbed power to incident power. Instead of taking the reflected to incident, we take the absorbed power to incident. And the pattern changes in a way that 0 and 1 will have a different meaning. 1 in this case would be heaven, or all energy goes into the middle ear and hopefully to the cochlea. And 0 means hell. What that means that all energy is reflected and nothing goes into the middle ear and cochlea. So the pattern that you would see is going to look like this. So what that means that a lot of energy is transferred into the middle ear across these range of frequencies. And at the very low frequency, you have a lot of reflection, not much energy goes in. And at the very high frequency, a lot of energy is reflected and not doesn't go in. And if you remember your hearing science course, this is very much resembles the middle ear transfer function, because the middle ear is very efficient in transferring energy roughly between 1 to 5K, and that is represented here too. No, so give me the name. What are the names that have been used in the research? So absorbance is the one that we actually covered. It could be in different format, and different researchers have used different names for it in their publication. And as I mentioned, the researchers and we agreed to use a general terminology of wideband acoustic immittance and try to represent our data in absorbance as well as a form of a phase angle, which we're going to come and talk about it. So, but you have to make sure this is not a reflectometry, which has also been introduced in the literature in the past. It's very different than reflectometry. So wideband tympanometry is another general terminology that has been used specific to one machine. It's under the category of wideband acoustic immittance. And the difference is that then you're going to run it at multiple pressure point, and that's why it's called wideband tympanometry. So absorbance tympanometry, average wideband absorbance. There are two machines that are available that can actually run this. One is called Mimosa Acoustic, and they come in a handheld version and a laptop version. So this box will connect to your laptop. This is a calibration cavity that is common between the two. It's using a ER10C, which is a heavier probe. It's a high fidelity probe from Etymotic research. And it's using foam tips, although it has a plastic tips for babies. And these foams has to be shaped and placed in the ear canal. So this was the first commercially available system. And it's also capable of doing acoustic emission too. So this one in the handheld version can do the distortion product acoustic emission as well as wideband acoustic immittance for screening purposes. And this one is more robust because it has more option. And also you can get a more detailed version of it that has more OAEs and suppression. And it also does wideband acoustic immittance, but it can only run it at the static pressure. What that means that it won't be able to change the pressure. Now, the good question would be, would change of the pressure make a difference, or would add on more information? We're going to come and talk about that part too. So on this picture, you would see the older calibration cavity. So they changed the calibration cavity to metallic. So in the old days, it was the kind of different. So, and this is Mimosa acoustic, and then you would have calibrated here, depending whether you would have used foam tips or rubber tips. And here's the ER10C flushed in the ear canal. And the system is called MEPA, or Middle Ear Power Analysis System. And the company that is manufacturing this is called Mimosa Acoustic, which is basically a spin-off from the work of John Allen. John Allen's wife, Pat Jane, actually commercialized this first by DP2000, which was the OAE machine, and then expanded that to the, it's a very good solid machine. Now, the idea is that whether adding pressure changes would make a difference or not. So most of you may be asleep at this time, so let's take a bit of break. And what I will do, I will also turn my video off so you guys can actually relax a bit and then come back. If you have any questions, this is a good time to ask some questions.
Yeah, we got, I think, one question is asking about how does the perforation in different quadrants in the tympanic membrane vary the results of wideband acoustic immittance?
We do have a section that we're going to come. It may not be as robust to location of perforation, but it is robust to the size of perforation. So we do have some cases that we're going to cover for you guys. So not much on location of the perforation, but a good indicator of the size of perforation.
I have a question, Professor. As you mentioned, the advantage of 1000 hertz tympanometry in infants. So why we don't use the 1000 hertz tympanometry as a standard for adults and children?
Well, it's a good question. Actually, the better question would be why we're not using multi-frequency instead of single frequency 226, which is even better than the 1K tympanometry. The issue has always been this lag that between what we know in research and what's working in the clinic. Usually in the clinic, we want to use something that is easy to implement and easy to interpret by the clinicians. And that was a hesitation from the clinician not adopting multi-frequency tympanometry. And there are normative data available for both adults and kids. And if you use multi-frequency tympanometry, is much better than conventional, and if you use wideband acoustic, is much better than the two. Now we're going to cover a lot of cases hopefully today, and then it's up to the clinicians to see if they want to adopt a technique that actually is much superior or better than the traditional technique that they have been using in the clinic and provides much better information. This adoption by the clinicians that is the important part.
Thank you, Professor. You are going for a break or what?
If you guys are good, we can actually, so this is kind of a break, so do something different than listening to me. So we can continue. I'll provide a short breaks in between my lecture. So if you guys are okay.
I think we are fine. I think we have another question here. Could middle ear transfer function be measured with a standard tympanometry?
No, you're just using one frequency. You cannot measure. And if you look at the transfer function of the middle ear, it's the worst transfer function at 226 hertz. And you're kind of looking, if I go back here to this picture, so you're measuring the middle ear transfer function at its least efficiency point. So you cannot measure the whole range of the transfer function by just using a 226 probe tone. Okay, so let's continue then.
Okay, boss.
So wideband reflectance, this is the earlier version. It's a research device that was developed by Interacoustics based on work of David Kemp. And it was a tympanometer, which was connected to a card deluxe in the computer. And then we were able to run wideband tympanometry across the same frequency range that I discussed, 250 to 8000 hertz. And the machine was able to measure the middle ear across wider range of frequency in a very short period of time and a multiple pressure point. Later on, this is the output of the same device. So you would have got this 3D, which on this axis you have frequency, and on this axis you have absorbance. Remember, 0 was everything reflected, and 1, everything is absorbed. And if you look at this pattern, it shows that you get a lot of energy absorbed across this region, and at which pressure? At 200 decapascal. If you look at the 0 decapascal, you could look at the energy pattern that will look different at different pressure point. So you could have sliced it different ways. So you could have looked at the pressure and absorbance, which is this one, looks like tympanogram. Or you could have looked at the absorbance, which is the kind of frequency and absorbance. So that would have given you the tympanogram that you're familiar with, as well as the absorbance pattern across different pressure, or tympanogram across multiple frequencies. So later on, that device was commercialized into what is called these days as Titan, wideband acoustic immittance. And as you can see, now it's much smaller, and it connects to a laptop, and is more user-friendly. Again, I'll repeat myself, I'm not affiliated with any manufacturer, and I have all devices in my lab, and I'm using them on an ongoing basis. So this is a clinical version that is available commercially now. And basically, this is the output of the system when you do your measurement, and from low to high frequencies. And this is negative pressure to positive pressure, low frequency to high frequency, and 0 to 1. So what I do now, actually, I wanted to give you the break right now because I have to switch the system to kind of do a demonstration. So why don't we take a few minutes break? If it's all right with you, then I might switch my system to show you a quick demo. And so in order to do that, I have to log off and log in. So you guys stay on. I'll do the log off and log in and come back again in a few minutes.
That's it.
Okay?
Okay, Bruce.
Okay. Okay, I'm back on. Do you have my audio?
Yeah, the sound is very good.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to share my screen again so that, so if you could kind of make me a co-host again so that I can share my screen.
Sure, Professor.
Thank you. So have you been able to make me a co-host?
Not yet. Just
Okay,
getting.
let me know.
Yeah. Change
Okay.
co-host. Yes. Okay, bro. Done now.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, there we go. So I've activated the program at my end. So this is the program, actually, Titan software. I have the full version at my end. So I'll do a simulation for you. I'll go to impedance module on the system. And the good thing about this machine, you can create your own protocol. And when you create your own protocol, it's subject to automation. What that means that if I click start, it will actually go through a set of testing for me. Let me go and do this simulation here. So once I set up my protocol, so what this protocol means that I set up a set of parameters for the system to go through. So I will tell what are the range, what are the speed, what are the parameters that I would like to see. And the machine goes through that and make the measurement. So I've already set it up. So it will go through all these protocols that I've set on the left side, and the results going to be shown. This is the actual, it's a slower pump speed in simulation, but in reality, I use a faster pump speed. So it goes much faster. So let's do this. So the test is done on the one of the protocol, and then it goes through my reflex measurement. I set up what is consists of a reflex, and it will look for my criterion, which is 0.02 from baseline. And this done. So I'll go on the first tab. So this is a 3D that I told you guys. So here is the pressure, here is the frequency, and here is the absorbance. So I can move this in different angles. But the cool thing about this is that I can ask to show me only the pressure versus absorbent, which is very similar to tympanometry. So if I click here, let's show me the pressure and absorbance. And this is a slide here. And I can look at 226 all the way to 8,000 hertz. Or I can go and look at here, which is the frequency and absorbance. So if I click here, it will give me this. Then I can actually look at the different pressure. So look at the impact of the pressure. So here, negative pressure, positive pressure. So the impact of pressure absorbed. So one thing that you can see, even a small pressure change can have a significant impact on absorbance. And that's why maybe using the pressure is a good thing, because even a small pressure can have a significant impact on absorbance. So this is a one measure as I did, and you get everything that you need. So if you still want to use your tympanogram, if you go on this tab, you can see your 226 and 1000 tymp. And here you can actually go and call BNGs at the same time. So it's 1B, 1G. And here at 1K, you can go and call your BNGs. You can say 3B, 1G, but the notch is below the tail, so it's mass dominated now. So this is one measure, and you get everything that you need. You don't have to do tympanometry. You just run this, and you will have your tympanogram. You also have your absorbance here. So here, absorbance at peak and ambient, and it's a normative data. The shaded area is shown here. And you have your tympanogram, your reflexes. So all the information that you would need are there at a glance for you to use. So let's go back and continue a lecture. So I needed to switch from my desktop to laptop because the software is on my laptop to be able to kind of show you the simulation. So it's the same from the same simulation that I did. So you will get everything that you would need, different tympanogram, different proton frequencies, different absorbances in one test mode without a requirement to do further assessment. So here is your wideband tympanogram, or you can look at the absorbance or tympanogram, depending how you want to look at it. So you can get your resonant frequencies, your ear canal volume, everything that you would normally get when you do tympanogram, you would get off one measure from this. So here is your 226 tympanogram, your 1K tympanogram, and this is what we call an average, which averaging the absorbance across these frequency and plotted as a function of pressure. So the decision of that averaging that I showed you is based on information that was observed from previous research that the frequency range between roughly 400 Hertz to 2K may provide a good information for differential diagnosis. That's why if you look at this averaging, they use that. So right now, they're not giving you the option to change this averaging, but later on, we have suggested to them to kind of give that option to clinicians so they can do averaging across different frequencies. So hopefully they will listen and they make some changes. But right now this one is fixed. And it's based on some older research that showed that this frequency range will provide a better differential diagnosis. So here is absorbance, remember 1. And you see a percentage point here because they multiplied by 100 to give you a percentage point, but this is still 0 and 1. 1, everything absorbed. 0, everything reflected. Shaded area, the normative data. If you have your own normative data, you can actually call and the shaded area will change. So this is based on the work of, I think, Chris Sanford and colleague, the normative data in adults here. And then you will have absorbance at peak, which is -7 decapascal, and ambient. And because the peak and ambient are not very different, you see the absorbance in blue and in gray are very close together. So some practical issues when you want to do wideband acoustic immittance. Susan Ross have looked at a lot of these variables in her early research. And one of those variables is called the insertion depth of the probe. And her data is shown in reflectance, which is reciprocal. Not reciprocal, is 1 minus of absorbance. So basically you have to flip it to get absorbance. So if you flip it 180 degree, it becomes absorbance. But the idea is the same. When you look at the reflectance, 1 is everything reflected, 0, everything is absorbed. If you look at absorbance, it's the other way around. 0 is everything is reflected, and 1, everything is absorbed. Most of the early research has shown reflectance, but it's the same thing. You just have to flip it to get the absorbance. So what do you think that you can see if you have a shallow insertion and deep insertion? It will have a different impact. So these numbers refers to proximity to the eardrum. So if you see a big number, it means it's far from the eardrum. If you see a smaller number, it means closer to the eardrum. So the 3 millimeter represent a deep insertion, 11 millimeter represent a shallow insertion. So what we can see that if you do a shallow insertion, you'll see a variability at the low frequencies, more so than the high frequencies, and not much at the peak absorbance. So what does it tell you, the take-home message? You have to use a deep insertion for 2 reasons, because your tail at the low frequencies will become more robust in terms of showing the actual reflection pattern. And the other more important reason, your test becomes more reliable. We call it test-retest reliability. So if you take the probe out and put it back in with the same depth of insertion, I'll get the same pattern, regardless how many times you would do that. So here's a practical example that I tried to simulate for you. This is an example of a shallow insertion. I still could change the pressure. So change of the pressure is not a good indication of the proper probe placement. So you may be able to establish a seal and be able to change the pressure, but it does not necessarily an indication of a good probe insertion. So I purposefully did this using a shallow insertion. As you can see, my 3D pattern is way above the baseline. And look at the low tail here. It's kind of way off. Then I did the same ear with a deeper insertion. See, this one came back to the baseline, and look at the lower tail. So by looking at the lower tail, you can actually have a good gauge in terms of knowing if you have placed the probe properly in the ear. If you see that at the low end it goes up, that means that you have not placed the probe properly. But if you see a uniform reduction at the low frequency, then that's a good indication of a good probe insertion, as well as looking at the 3D, which is closer to the baseline. The other very good thing about deep insertion is that this deep insertion is also an excellent practice for autoacoustic emission too. So regardless whether you do OAE or whether you do wideband, the deep insertion will actually improve your recording quality. The other more important issue is that when you do a deep insertion, then if you run it multiple times, you get the same pattern. So these bars shows the differences. As you can see with the deep insertion, you always get a very replicable pattern with very small variation, which is ideal because you want to know if you have tested someone from day 1 to day 2 or day 3, the changes is because of a pathology, not because of a test-retest reliability. Doug Keefe and colleagues look at the, Patrick Feeney and colleagues look at the long-term test-retest reliability. So they did it at multiple time intervals. And the long-term test-retest reliability is also excellent. So these are reflectance pattern. As I mentioned, 1 is everything is reflected, 0, everything is absorbed. So if you flip this, it becomes absorbance. So, and here are a different time intervals, meaning that tested someone at 0.1 and then several days later, and as you can see, 423 days later. with no changes in the middle ear. So you see very similar pattern. So long-term test reliability is also very excellent using this technology. So the take-home message is that with a deep probe insertion, if you want to do wideband acoustic immittance, the same take-home message can be applied to autoacoustic emission too. What is the impact of the pressure on wideband acoustic immittance? One of my thesis students have looked at this one, and as I mentioned earlier, it may have a great impact. So if I go back to my simulation here, and I go here, and I go here. So here is your absorbance at peak. Now, see if I have a negative pressure, what will happen. So if I increase the pressure negatively, you will see that the peak of the absorbance move or shift more toward the higher frequencies, and the range of the frequency in which the middle ear deficient becomes narrower. Same thing will happen if I introduce positive pressure. So here is the absorbance at peak, roughly. Now, if I introduce the positive, same thing. So the range of frequency at which the middle ear is very efficient becomes narrower and shifts to the higher frequency. You get more reflection at the low frequencies too. So the effect of negative and positive are very similar, a bit different, but very similar overall. So as you can see, it could have a significant impact on absorbance pattern. That's one of the reasons that we are recommending to be able to run absorbance at multiple pressure points rather than at just one single pressure point. Because if you have a negative pressure, that could have a significant impact on your absorbance pattern. So one of my students have looked at this, and we simulated the pressure by doing a maneuver of Valsalva and Toynbee because they create negative and positive pressure, and compared the peak and ambient absorbance by using these maneuvers. And look, it's a huge difference if you actually introduce different pressure points and do absorbance. But once you run it at peak, those differences will disappear. So it has a significant impact. So that's why it's important to run the absorbance at peak to kind of avoid the impact of the pressure and absorbance. So it could have a significant impact, and the normative data changes too, depending on whether you do that ambient or peak. So it's important to run the absorbance at peak as well as at ambient, and you can look at the differences. So that Titan machine is capable of doing that if you set the protocol properly. So those are some of the caveats in measuring the wideband acoustic immittance. Now we can actually go ahead and talk about the application of it in different populations. Is there any questions so far? Okay.
So
let's go. This is yes. Go ahead.
I have few questions myself. As you mentioned, that is in clinical settings, people look for something more practical, more easy to do, more straightforward to interpret. And for this new technology, which I have the opportunity to be trained in most of the systems you mentioned in your presentation, but not each clinic has the system. So that's why it's not clear to our audience that what kind of valuable information we can get from the wideband immittance metry. What is the situations it can help in proper diagnosis, or can give a highly valuable diagnostic information? In which conditions it has some specificity or some specific pattern. I know that many research done and tested the wide band immittance, like in different conditions of middle ear otosclerosis, superior canal dehiscence, Meniere's disease, ossicular discontinuity, and there is patterns for each. So I think it's important for us to hear from you as expert in this topic. What is the future? What is the value of getting the system to be part of our routine practice? In which clinical scenarios it can make a huge difference?
Actually, from this point on, you will get the practical application of it in all those pathologies. So we're going to cover all the pathologies and the outcome of the wideband. Actually, just to make it short now, and then once I finish, hopefully I'll convey the same message. Whatever you see with 226 or 1K, you will see with wideband. But those things that you could see with wideband, you cannot see with 226 and 1K tympanometry that you're currently doing. So it's going to actually expand your diagnostic profiling significantly. And as we go along, talk about different cases and group analysis, hopefully I can convey that message. Actually, that's the idea from this point on. So we're going to go through different populations, so babies, children, and adults, because each of these populations will have a different prevalence of the diseases. So for example, kids have more prevalence of the otitis media, but adults have otosclerosis or other pathology that impacts the ossicular chain. And we're going to talk about the P tube and perforation. Hopefully I'll convey the a better sensitivity, a better specificity using this technology compared to the current technology that is being used in the clinic.
We have just one question here from Asif Basha. Could you please elaborate on the tympanometric compensation? Do we see this in wide immittance metry, wideband immittance metry?
If I have heard it correctly, admittance compensation?
Yes.
So often in the clinic, when you put the probe in the ear canal, the probe is far from the eardrum. So what you're interested is measuring admittance at the level of the eardrum. And that's why you're pressurizing. So the idea is that at the peak, you're measuring ear canal and middle ear. And when you increase the pressure at the very high positive, at the very high negative, you're measuring ear canal. So subtracting the peak from the tail of admittance will give you compensated admittance, which is the admittance at the level of the eardrum, or YTM. Now, the methodology is not mathematically correct because admittance is a complex number. You can't subtract it as admittance. But at the very low frequency, the mathematical error is small. But at the high frequency, the mathematical error is much bigger. So if you want to do that, you have to compensate susceptance and conductance and then transfer the two into admittance. But again, that YTM has been used in Jaeger classification system to say AS, stiffness dominated system. It's not very accurate at the low frequency because you may have ossicular discontinuity with the same pattern as otosclerotic ears. And that's a more common pattern than AD versus AS. I'm going to talk about some of these in the context of wideband acoustic immittance as we go along and talk about different cases.
Two more questions, Professor. So
sure.
The first question, what is the optimum frequency to measure the acoustic reflexes? So this is one point. The other point, what is the optimum frequency to measure the external canal volume?
External ear canal volume, if that's the goal of the measurement, 226 can be used for measuring of the external ear canal volume. It's not the exact estimate of the volume of the ear canal, because even if you put a positive pressure or negative pressure, put the probe in your ear, you can still hear the probe tone. So it's not the ear canal. So it's underestimated. The best way to measure the ear canal volume is to fill the ear canal with the fluid to see how much it will take for the fluid to fill up. That's the exact measurement of the volume. In terms of the other question for the reflex, It depends on the population. For adults, 226 is adequate. For kids, you should not use, especially below 6 months of age, you should not use 226. You have to use 1K for measuring of the reflex.
One more point, and sorry for asking many questions.
No.
I think one of the advantages of wideband acoustic immittance methodology is that you can do some assessment to the middle ear function without using the pressure. I mean, like the static, as this is maybe more tolerable in infants, young children. So, is it practical, or is it really can be a valid test without using the pressure changes?
Well, we can run it. You're right. I mean, you don't have to change the pressure. You can run it at ambient pressure, or we can run it at multiple pressure. But the technology is using a very fast, short click, so it doesn't take much. So it's more comfortable compared to regular tympanometry. So it's going to actually test a very wide range of frequency at a very short period of time. So you have a small time window to test babies, and this will actually give you that small time window to test them. So let's go along and talk about the application of it. This is actually from our case. So we tested babies from birth to 6 months of age longitudinally. And this is actually using a Minusa acoustic probe. So it's an actual test subject that we did. That's why I put the picture here. There are a lot of differences in the ear canal and middle ear of the baby that makes them different from an adult and makes their middle ears very different. So that's why they have to be looked at differently. And that's why you're using a different proton frequencies. Some of those differences have been summarized here. Canal is shorter, narrower, softer tissue. Eardrum is kind of sleeping on the ear canal. It's not at 58-degree angle. You have some amniotic fluid or other gooey stuff in the middle. It takes time to get resolved. Pneumatization will take time. Ossicle orientation will change over time at the middle ear, and tympanic membrane will change their orientation. So all those things makes it a very different middle ear compared to the adult. And here is a good snapshot of an adult ear canal, middle ear, and a baby. So all soft tissues, you have bone and cartilage here. Diameter is narrower, eardrum is closer to ear canal. Here is kind of easier to visualize. And middle ear cavity is smaller. So all those things will make a big difference between babies versus adult middle ear. And here are the absorbance patterns that we observe at the time of birth to 6 months of age as we tested them on 1 month interval. And as you can see, one of the differences from the birth, which is this is close to visit 1 and visit 2 means time of birth with 1 month old. 6 means 6 months of age. You see the low frequency, they get more reflection as they grow older. And this is because of the soft tissue here. So what that means that the soft tissue will absorb the low frequency, and that is why your low end tail at the time of birth has less reflection and more of absorption. The majority of the changes are at the high frequency. So what that means that during the visit 1, your middle ear is not as efficient at high frequency in transferring energy. But as you grow older, I mean to 6 months of age, you see an improvement in transfer of energy at the high frequency. So the middle ear becomes more efficient across these frequencies as the baby grows older. So that will tell you that you may need a different normative data, a different age group, and also will tell you if you are doing any physiological assessments such as ABR. You need to actually reassess them because the middle ear at high frequencies have different efficiency at different time. So although you're using the same intensity, but that intensity may not be as efficient at the time of birth, but it becomes more efficient when you grow older. So people have looked at the normative data, different age group, and this is the same study with the reflectance. So this is absorbance representation of the same thing. And the test retest reliability is very good, meaning that if I take the probe in and out in a babies, the differences between the two measures are very close. And it's much smaller than potential pathology changes in absorbance pattern. So maturation effect has also been looked at in other research. So there are maturation effects. So that may result in different normative data across different age groups. So one thing that people have asked, so I'm using 1K probe to test the babies, would wideband will provide a better separation than 1K probe tone that I'm using for babies. So that has been looked at by different researchers over time. And they've looked at a group of newborn hearing screening using a transient, using discussion product with acoustic emission. And they looked at the pass and reefer in that cohort. And they wanted to know how accurate 1K tympanometry versus wideband acoustic immittance is in predicting the pass or fail on OAE. Because as you know, most of the fail on OAE is because of the middle ear, not because of the cochlea in babies. So they established a wideband absorbance pattern, and they've noticed that the pattern of the pass and reefer, as is shown in this figure, across this frequency range, which is around roughly 1K to 2500 or 3K, are not overlapping, meaning there's a complete separation. So one question, which frequency range is most effective? It may depend on the age as well as the pathology. So in this cohort, it seems that the frequency range around 1500 hertz all the way to 3 kilohertz has a very good separation of absorbance pattern between a group of babies who pass and a group of babies who fail the OAEs. So within the same cohort, so this is the same pattern. I kind of show you the no overlap here. So this means that no overlap. So these patterns are not overlapping between those who passed and those who failed. So the one way to look at which frequency to use, so for averaging, for example, it's around 1 to roughly 2500 hertz here. So they also looked at the, this is called receiver operating characteristic, or ROC. And this is a best way to know if one test is performing better than the other test. So they looked at the accuracy of 1K probe tone tympanometry versus the accuracy of the wideband acoustic immittance in predicting pass or fail on OAEs in their cohort. And if your ROC is closer to upper left corner of this graph, that means that your test is better than the other test that is closer to this diagonal line, which is called chance. Or a better way is to measure the area under these curves, which is called area under the ROC curve. So the wideband reflectance across this range provided a better separation of those who pass versus referred on ROC analysis versus 1K probe tone. So and this is called evidence-based practice. So if you want to do evidence-based practice and you want to know if one technology is better than the other, or one test is better than the other, you kind of try to set up what we call ROC analysis, which is a plot of sensitivity as a false alarm. And if the area under the ROC for one test is significantly, or called statistically larger than the area of the other test, then we can actually, with a fairly good certainty, say that that test is outperforming the other test. And in this case, predicting pass or refer on OAEs was much better for wideband acoustic immittance compared to 1K probe tone. So this is not the only study that has shown this. Later on, Lisa Hunter and colleagues did the same study and also showed the same thing. So this is not just from the single study. So overall, if you're asking, does 1K probe tone better predict pass or fail on OAE, then yes, wideband is actually much better or superior to 1K tympanometry to predict that for you. Here is of the study of Priv and colleague, and they wanted to look at the different groups of conductive components as measured by air and bone tone burst ABR, and look to see if the wideband can predict the presence of a conductive component versus a gold standard, which is air and bone ABR. So they established a pattern in a group of babies who passed and a group of babies who had a confirmed air-bone gap by using air and bone ABR tone burst. And they had 43 years with the normal hearing and 17 years with the conductive hearing loss, as shown by air-bone gap on air and bone tone burst ABR. So they established something that's called Cohen index or Cohen's D, which is also an indication of separation of people with a normal hearing versus people with conductive hearing loss. And you look at the wideband Cohen's D here across different frequencies versus the different parameters that you can get at 678 Hertz probe tone or 1K probe tone. And you can see the Cohen's D for wideband at 1600 Hertz for prediction of the presence of a conductive was higher than parameters that are being used than at 1K probe tone. Here is another study from the Voss and colleagues, and they looked at, again, newborn who were referred on OAE and newborns who passed. So this is reflectance. Again, reflectance is the same as absorbance, but it's flipped. So again, just to refresh your mind, 1 is everything reflected and 0, everything is absorbed. So as you can see, the newborn who passed the OAEs or the screening protocol have a much higher absorbance versus the newborns who fail on that ear. So this is comparing 1 ear who passed or group of ear who passed in 1 ear and group of ear who failed on the other ear. Now they followed them up until the problem in the middle ear resolved, and then you can see it bounced back to what is considered to normal. So what does this study gives you is that the wideband can actually be a good predictor of a change in the middle ear system as it heals. So you can use this in conjunction with OAEs to see if the OAE fail is likely because of a conductive or likely because of a cochlea. This is very important because many of the OAE fail is because of the middle ear. And then if it shows that it's bouncing back, then OAE could be a pass. So you can actually use this technology in conjunction with OAE to kind of follow up your cases and do more rescreen rather than doing diagnostic until the middle ear problem is resolved. So to take a take-home message of this, you can use this technology for screening of the babies rather than using ABR or OAEs alone. And this technology, if it's combined with the right technology, then can be used for both NICU babies and well babies. What that means that if you use wideband acoustic immittance with OAEs and a reflex, you can actually not only say if it's a pass or fail, you can also say what is the reason for fail, which the screening outcomes with the current technology that are being used is not capable of doing that. So if you're using ABR or using OAEs or combination of the two, it's binary outcome. What that means that it's pass or refer. It will not tell you what is the reason of a refer until you go and do your diagnostic protocol. But using a combination of wideband acoustic immittance and reflex and the OAE, you can actually have a prediction of a reason for fail. For example, if your wideband tympanogram is normal and wideband reflex is normal, again, I put wideband reflex because one of you guys asked me the question, which frequency to use for measuring reflex. You don't have to make that selection with wideband because wideband measures reflex across a wide range of frequencies. So one measure will measure the reflex between 250 to 2000 hertz. So you have your reflex across a wide range of frequency based on the change in wideband. So that question is not relevant anymore in wideband reflex because you have a wider range of frequency rather than picking which frequency to use. So if your wideband tympanometry is normal, your reflex is normal, and your OAE is normal, then it's normal. However, if your wideband tympanometry is not normal and your reflex is absent, for example, or elevated, or is absent, it could likely be a conductive. If your wideband is normal, your reflex is kind of elicited normal, but your OAE is absent, it's likely cochlea. And if your wideband is normal and your reflex is absent, but your OAE is normal, it's likely auditory neuropathy. So that's why this one can be used both in NICU babies as well as well babies rather than having different protocols. One of my students did a study using wideband babies, and we looked at a cohort of babies in a hospital, and the idea was to see if the First Nation group will have a higher incidence of a fail because of a conductive, because we use the reflex wideband and OEs together, and we wanted to know if it's a fail. Is it more common? Is it more common to be due to conductive in the First Nation versus other ethnic groups? So there were 213 babies that we tested using the wideband and reflex and OEs. Same pattern that we discussed earlier in terms of the outcome. And overall, on the First Nation group, we had 28 passes. On Caucasian group, we had 179 passes. Fail was 13 and 27. So the number of the fail was higher in the First Nation compared to the Caucasian. And then we look at the pattern that was emerging, and it was more likely to fail our screening paradigm due to potential pattern that is consistent with conductive in the First Nation compared to the Caucasian. So also we looked at the wideband acoustic immittance between those who pass or fail, similar to what Sanford and Lisa Hunter did in their studies. And as you can see, screening outcome for a pass in blue in absorbance is very different than the screening outcome who fail in red. And this is ambient and this is peak. One thing that you will notice that the differences are larger, so it could potentially be more helpful to run it at both. And the machine does it at both. You don't have to run it twice. You run it once and the machine does it both, so you're not missing anything. But the take-home message is that there's a huge difference with no overlap within the absorbance pattern for those who pass, blue, versus those who fail, red, regardless whether you run it at ambient or peak. So again, I'm not going to go on all details. So this is the main take-home message that I wanted to convey. So I'm going to bypass some of these slides and go to the second section, which is ambient versus peak. So which one? Should I use one or two or both? So here is what you can see. Here is a screening outcome in fail. It's ambient and peak in babies. So those babies who fail, if you look at the absorbance patterns at peak is the red. If you look at the absorbance at the ambient, it's blue. So you can see the absorbance is a bit higher at peak for those who fail. And if you look at the absorbance pattern for those who pass, is also higher. So it's a more efficient way of measuring middle ear transfer function if you use the peak rather than the ambient, even if it's a pass or fail. So we also looked at the pattern of the absorbance in different group of babies who pass, Caucasian versus First Nation versus mixed. And we noticed that overall, even in those babies who passed but were of First Nation heritage, they had a lower absorbance compared to other ethnic groups. So it could be a bit of different normative data that could be considered in the future direction. We did the same studies in adults, and we noticed some ethnic differences too. Now, here is the actual case study. So you may ask how these things can be applied. This is in a reflectance. It's often one of our cases at the Children's Hospital, and it was referred to us, and we kind of worked with the pediatric otolaryngologist to kind of see what's going on. So again, reflectance, if you recall, 1 is everything is reflected, and 0, everything is absorbed. Absorbance is the other way around. Most of our early research was based on reflectance, but we agreed to present all the future data in absorbance. So this is the normative data. So this is the 10th percentile to 90th percentile, and this is the mean of the normals. So anything that falls here is normal range. So it was done a play audiometry for this, I think it was 2 years old. And they noticed that there's a conductive component at 250, at 500 hertz. So it was more than 10 dB gap. Although the hearing was within the normal range, but there was a conductive component. When they did tympanometry, the right ear had a normal tympanogram at 226 for shape, tympanometric width, and YTM, and OE was present. On the left, it was flat, and OE was absent. So they were baffled, and they repeated this test several times, and they still saw the same conductive component on the right side. So when we did the wideband acoustic immittance, as you can see, right is in red and left is in blue. We noticed that both right and left are not normal, but the left had a more reflection than the right. So once the ENT actually checked the eardrum and the fluid, they noticed that the left ear was filled with fluid, and the right ear has a level of the fluid which did not fill the middle ear cavity. So in a sense, the left was more severe in presence of the fluid in terms of the amount, and right was not as much as the left, but they both had fluid, but which was not identified using, so it was kind of not consistent with tympanogram and OEs on the right, but reflectance clearly showed abnormality on both sides. Here is another newborn that we tested. Again, it had a flat tymp at 1 kilohertz tympanogram, and OE was absent. A broadband reflex at 1K was absent ipsilaterally. And the presence of conductive component was verified by tone burst ABR at 500 hertz. And as you can see, again, the normative data is shown here. So this is the 5th percentile and 95th percentile and the mean. So if it falls within this range, it's normal. As you can see, both right and left are not normal. So it clearly shows that there's a conductive component as shown by the tone burst ABR at 500 hertz. Again, it's another case. Again, you say that it's showing the abnormality. Does it show the normal? Again, it's a normal tymp at 1K, OE absent, and BBM reflex at 1K present ipsilaterally. So your wideband is normal, within the range of a normal. So this is one of the cases I actually tested, we identified as having a sensorineural hearing loss. So the reason for fail in OAE was because of a sensorineural And because the reflex is present, it's not profound, because you cannot have a reflex of profound. So you can kind of use this also as a prediction of severity of the loss too, in conjunction with reflex and OAE. Again, another case, so in this one, you see a 226 tympanograms here. This is 226 tympanograms for the right, and this is 226 tympanogram for the left. This is 1K probe tone for the right and 1K probe tone for the left. And shaded area is the normal range. So regardless, for the right and left, screening outcome is shown here. ABR is pass, TOE is refer. On this one, ABR is refer and TOE is refer. Okay. So if you look at the 1K tymp here and here, they both show abnormal 1K tymp. And if you look at the wideband, the right ear is normal, and the left ear shows clear abnormality. And later, it will identify that the right ear has a mild sensorineural hearing loss, nothing to do with conductive, as opposed to 1K that showed abnormality because of a conductive, but the left ear had a conductive, which was resolved later. There's another case, again, same thing, you have 226 and 1K corresponding tympanograms for the right and left. Screening outcome, ABR pass, TOE refer, ABR refer, TOE refer. In this case, both the right and left was clearly abnormal. So it kind of shows you whatever you see with 1K, you can see with wideband. And those things that you can see with wideband, you cannot see with 1K tympanogram. Another case, again, left and right ear, 226 and 1K, left ear, 226 and 1K. On the right ear, you have ABR pass and TOE pass. So your tymp at 1K is normal. If you look at the right ear is normal. On the left ear, the 1K is clearly abnormal, and you see a abnormality on the absorbance, but not much of an absorbance at the mid frequencies. Again, another case, you see that the 226 and 1K tympanograms, one ear, which is the right ear, and left ear 226 and 1K, normal here at 1K. For the right ear, ABR pass, OE pass, and it's within normal range. And here it's clearly 1K abnormality in the left, ABR and OE were referred, and you see it's most likely because of a conductive component. Any questions so far?
I think we have a couple of questions, Professor.
Sure,
So
sure.
The first question, with such wide normative range, how sensitive is the test?
Say that again.
Midula Jane asking, with such wide normative range, how sensitive is this test?
Actually, why the normative data is wide, the changes in the pattern is significant enough to put, especially the presence of the fluid, by 100%, almost 100% below the normal range. We're going to talk about kids shortly, and you will see some of the sensitivity and specificity data on them.
Another question from Adia. She asking if you can elaborate on why the First Nations results were so different.
Why? Which pathology? Sorry.
She didn't mention the question as written. Can you please elaborate on why the First Nations results were so different?
Well, it's a good question. Our question was that because First Nation group, whether in Canada, United States, or Australia, they have a higher prevalence of otitis media. If you're familiar with the literature, and the question was that there are mainly because of environmental reason, because they're not being breastfed exclusively for a long period of time. They're exposed to passive smoking, or they are cared by group settings, so it makes them more prone. And our question was that were they born to make them prone to be more prone to having otitis media? So that question has never been answered. So we wanted to know if they fail screening more often than the other ethnic groups, and if that's the case, is it because of a conductor or not? So that's
Professor, just because maybe the audience like me, it's about the indigenous people in Canada, right? Or United States.
Yes.
So
Yeah,
those are the original people or indigenous group of population. So just for the audience to know.
Yes, you're right. And we have a different terminology. We call them First Nation to be more accurate. And they may have indigenous terminology and other terminology being used, but they're like the first people who lived in the land. So, and United States and Australia have the same. Similar study was done earlier by another researcher was working with Joseph Kai, doing her PhD, Sir Devi Devi, and then she also found the same finding with the indigenous people in Australia. Okay, so hopefully you're still awake. We're gonna go just to the kids. Not sure if I'll be able to finish everything in 2 hours, but we'll do our best without actually putting it in a really fast forward mode, but so using the same pace. Again, kids, there are a couple of things that have been looked at. One of the things that have been looked at by Susan Wass in cadaver ears, she created different pressure points, as you can see here. And as you can see, the baseline is in thick black, and as positive or negative pressure introduced, you can see it has a significant impact at the low frequencies, and it's going to shift the high efficiency, high frequency to the higher frequencies. So same thing as I showed you earlier. So that shows you that's important to run wideband acoustic immittance at ambient and peak, rather than just an ambient. She also looked at the perforation size. So it's very easy in cadavers to create different perforation sizes in a very controlled fashion. So most of the studies that she did was in cadaver ears. So she created different perforation size. So the normal is this black one. And you can see the perforation size of 0.5 millimeters. So very small perforation can result in a significant change in absorbance. So, but very big perforation like this one, 3.3 millimeters, as you can see, it will have less impact, but it still shows the impact to be mainly at the high frequencies than the low frequencies. But a very small perforation will have a huge impact across all frequencies. So it's kind of show you that it does have a very good kind of correlation with the size of the perforation, which tympanometry doesn't. So in tympanometry, you use ear canal volume. And whether the small perforation or big perforation, it won't tell you much different story. But in absorbance, as you can see, the perforation size can have a different impact. I think that one of the early questions, whether this can actually identify the location. No, it won't be able to identify the location, but it can identify roughly the size of the perforation, which the tympanometry is not capable of doing that. Here is one of our studies. So we looked at a cohort of children between 3 to 7 years of age who were normal, as well as having different negative pressure and presence of the fluid in the middle ear. And so this one, as you can see, it's reflectance again. It's normal. These two are negative pressures. One is milder, one is more severe negative pressure, and this is the fluid. So as you can see, it's a progression of a change from normal negative pressure to fluid. Now, this is a group data for all the fluid cases. So as you can see, the normative data is shown by this white area from 10 to 90th percentile. And this is the mean. All the cases with the fluid in the middle ear have been identified correctly. So this is called 100% sensitivity, 42 years. And this study was replicated later on by Ellison on his cohort. We also looked at the test-retest reliability and the difference between absorbance. And as you can see, if the test-retest reliability difference is shown here, and for the normal and middle ear, fluid in the middle ear is shown here. So it's much bigger, the difference between the middle ear effusion and the normal ear versus test-retest. So whatever we've seen is not because of a test-retest, it's because of the fluid. This is off Ellison's, he also looked at the fluid cases and he also had a similar findings. It's an overall reduction in absorbance. So here is the mean of a normal and here's the mean of the effusion. So overall reduction across all frequencies. This is from Lisa Hunter's study looking at the Down syndrome and looking at the ambient absorbance. And on the bottom, you see a group delay, which is measurement of the phase. And basically, she looked at the three cohort. If you look at the comparison of the absorbance, left panel to Down syndrome, right panel for diagnostic characteristics of the normal hearing, conductive hearing loss, and pressure localization tube. So it seems that there are some differences between normal and normal Down syndrome. And when they have a fluid, they also have some problem with conductive hearing loss. So we also did same studies later with another group in Brazil that kind of alluded to the same notion. So what the take-home message is that it could potentially be useful to use wideband acoustic immittance to see the impact of repeated otitis media, even when the middle ear gets back to the normal. So their mechanics could be still different, even if your middle ear is normal, but you had a history of repeated bouts of otitis media. This is in a PE tube, and this is done by Sanford and Brockett. And they look at the PE tubes and otitis media. So here is the normal shaded area in gray and the group with the middle ear fluid, as you can see. So all of them were identified correctly. There were some variation, but all of them were abnormal based on this shaded area. And this is from the PE2 group on the right panel. And as you can see, it's a distinctive pattern that's going to emerge from the fluid. So fluid, you see overall reduction in absorbance pattern. However, in fluid, in the PE tube, when it's open, you will see an increase in absorbance at the low frequency below 1K, which is very, very typical, as you can see. So it kind of shows you that emergence of different patterns for different pathologies are different. So it makes it very useful by using a pattern recognition. Here, this is from our study that we are running right now. And we want to look at the impact of different fluid type. So here is the left ear. So it's a fluid and retraction in the left ear. And you can see that. And on the right ear, it's a P tube. And so if we look at the pattern for the right and left, so right ear, remember, had a P tube, and left ear had fluid. See, it's emerging even different 3D patterns. So even the 3D patterns are amenable to pattern recognition using AI algorithm. And pattern on the tympanograms as you would use. So for P2, you usually see a very high volume on the right side, which actually is shown here. And on the reflectance, you see the same pattern as Sanford showed, so a very high peak absorbance for the P2 and all reduction in absorbance. Because we originally scheduled this for 2 hours, and I want to give some time for other questions. I'm not going to be able to cover everything, so but what I want to do, just move forward in time and go to kind of summary table here for you, so that we can actually make better senses in terms of the summary. Okay. So here is the summary. Basically, just want to give you an idea that this will give you as simple as a pattern recognition as you would have used with Jerga classification system with an ease of identification. So the normal is shown with a thick black line. If you have a disarticulation or articular discontinuity, it's the green one. You see a huge increase in absorbance at the below 1K. Again, similar pattern could be seen with the PE2, but again, it's going to be one peak here and one peak here, so it's going to be a bit different. The blue one here is fixation. So if you have an articular fixation, you see a reduction of absorbance at the lower end of frequency. Fluid, the red one, overall reduction, and pressure, you see a reduction at the low frequency and shift of the peak toward the high frequency. So it just gives you a distinctive pattern for different pathologies. Again, if you want to review the reflexes for wideband acoustic immittance, I've put some references there. I'm going to actually upload the PDF to my colleague so that he can distribute that to you guys if you're interested. And the direction and feature for the wideband is for screening purposes, detection of the conductive component, measuring the reflex, and adjustment of OE using the peak pressure rather than running it on ambient. Here is the group in our middle ear lab. My colleagues that have been working, some of them have graduated left, but some of them are still working. So that's why you see the picture changes. Here is all of the groups that we worked on the having a recommendation for wideband acoustic immittance. Boo Christensen, Heidi Nakajima, Bob Margolis. Here is the Joseph Kai. Here is Steve Neely, Susan Voss, Beth Reeve, Pat Feeney, Lisa Hunter, Chris Sanford, John Wazowski, David Liddy, Stefan Stenfeld, and this is me. In terms of the output of this group, we're publishing here in Hearing. There's a book that you can actually get. I have a conflict of interest on this because I'm one of the authors. So, but I had the good information on the basic and advanced principles. Another journal that had published a special issue on this topic is JAAA. It's a new book that I did a chapter on wideband acoustic, was edited by Stavros Hatsopoulos and some of my colleagues. It's a very good book, 2 volume. Again, it's a conflict of interest because I'm one of the authors. Chapter 2 is on wideband acoustic immittance on this one. So I'm going to conclude our talk. Again, sorry that I didn't have time to go over all the cases, but again, all upload the video so my colleague can distribute to the participants if they're interested. So a few minutes for questions.
Thank you, Professor. Really, we have very positive feedback, and we appreciate this very, very condensed and very informative. This is for me very valuable course. We appreciate and thank you very much for all this information.
Yeah, you're
And
welcome.
I think this course will have effect. In our online platform, we just shared some shots from your presentation, because always people hesitant to use something they don't know, they don't understand. So your presentation today, I have no doubt, it will help a lot to digest the topic, and it
Yeah, I
will
hope
be
so.
easy.
Yeah.
And I guarantee that I give the feedback for you. And if you don't mind, we will use the recording. We'll put it in the YouTube channel. We'll allow more people to get benefit from this very valuable, really sober and excellent presentation and excellent work. Not only the presentation, it's about the work and the expertise and the science behind. I have a question, Professor. You mentioned
Sure.
something that is you find that is like the regular tympanometry can return to normal and become type A, but still there is a change in the middle ear mechanics. So my
Yes.
question is, what is the correlation between behavioral audiometric threshold or estimated audiometric thresholds and the wide acoustic immittance? I mean, I agree with your question, because we used to say that is tympanometry is type A, but still there is airborne gap, still there is a conductive component, there is some conductive pathology. So my question is, there is any studies which look at the relation between the wide acoustic immittance and the audiometric thresholds?
Well, there has been some studies that have looked at the absorbance, it's called transmittance in decibel, and the behavioral threshold. Those studies are not that many and far in between. However, there are more studies that have looked at the correlation of wideband acoustic immittance and conductive component, and they are more convincing. But in terms of predicting of the behavioral threshold using air conduction, there has been some studies, very few studies, that look at the transmittance in decibels and the behavioral threshold. It's not conclusive and still far in between. So in that case, it's not very convincing for predicting of behavioral threshold. However, for predicting of the conductive component, there are more studies published, and it's still not 100% conclusive, but it's still better.
The second question, what is the role of wide acoustic immittance in the diagnosis of inner ear diseases such as Meniere's disease, superior canal dehiscence?
Very good question. It has been used in Meniere because it's going to change the pressure of endolymph, and that could have an impact on impedance, in the input impedance. So if there's any change in impedance into the system, then wideband acoustic immittance could potentially be impacted from what is considered to be normal. So it has been used by some researchers in Japan and some other countries to look at the Meniere disease. Still, the data is not conclusive, but promising. With regard to other question that you had, for what was the second part of the question that you had? For the superior canal dehiscence. Yeah, so actually there's an excellent work which I was going to cover but didn't have time. It's done by Rozowski and colleagues. They look at the amount of conductive component, which is called airborne gap, average across different frequencies, and wideband acoustic immittance average within a frequency range. And they noticed that if they plot the wideband acoustic immittance absorbance and airborne gap, superior canal dehiscence, otosclerotic ears, and articular discontinuity will cover different regions. So I'll just quickly bring it up so that you can see what I mean here. So here is the transmission or absorbance average between 600 hertz to 1K, and this is airborne gap average between 1 to 4K. And if you do that and you plot the these patterns, which is representing the red is a stapes fixation, blue is ossicular discontinuity, and green is superior canal dehiscence, you'll see they occupy with no overlap different regions. So it's very, very useful in a case dilemma, which your tympanogram at 226 most likely will show type A on all three. The AS and AD is an exception. So using wideband acoustic immittance in conjunction with average airborne gap resulted in a great separation, all these kind of three different conditions from each other.
One more last question, Professor. We used to have, like when we have type AD tympanogram, so always it's sometimes because of the scar in the tympanic membrane, and sometimes because of ossicular discontinuity. And in our experience, it's more common to find the AD with the scarred tympanic membranes, much more common than the ossicular discontinuity. So what is the pattern? How the wide acoustic immittance can differentiate between scarred tympanic membrane and ossicular discontinuity? And the same question for the type AS coming from otosclerosis and AS coming from adhesive otitis media.
Yeah, all very good question. I mean, it has been in the past that lateral pathology are more robust than medial pathology when you use tympanometry, say if you have a scar in TM and fixation or discontinuity, because the scarring is more lateral to the more medial pathology, it's going to show up more robustly on your tympanogram. There are some case studies that have been looked at. I've done one with perforation and ossicular problem, and it shows on the wideband acoustic immittance. In terms of the group data, still more work needs to be done to look at this question of having a combined pathology to see if the distinctive pattern can emerge to the point that you can actually identify the actual pathology in question. So that's a very good question, but it still remains to be answered. There are some cases, I have some few in my at my disposal that shows that if you have a perforation and some ossicular problem is going to show actually identified by the surgeon. But again, not many group studies that have been done, but it's an excellent study that needs to be done with the combined pathology to see if it's going to be identified or not. So in terms of a fixation pathology, there are two different kinds, such as otosclerosis or kind of having a lot of scarring on the TM, which cause the fixation of the eardrum. Again, those are still has to be looked at. It's all good questions. I don't have a cases on those yet, but I'm keeping my eyes open. I haven't seen any group data yet on that, but it's open research on that in those areas.
We have one more question, Professor. Meniere's results in modification of G tympanograms at 2 kilohertz. How does this show in wideband immittance or acoustic?
Yeah, can you repeat the question one more time?
One of the audience is asking that is Meniere's disease results in modification of G tympanograms at 2 kilohertz. How does this show in wideband acoustic immittance?
Well, some of the early studies have shown that the absorbance is lower in Meniere disease because of increased impedance at the input into the cochlea. Again, the tympanogram data on G at 2K are far in between, so not that many published paper in that area either. And there are actually more people are working on Meniere and wideband. I know some of my colleagues on that. I don't know whether they published it or not, but it's promising. It's overall showing more of a distinction of lower absorbance versus the normative data in Meniere disease.
I think this is the last question, Professor. We have enjoyed your presentation. We have enjoyed your answers for those questions. And we thank you very much. We appreciate the time and the great knowledge you put to this course. It's for us one of the most valuable courses organized by our group, and it's a practice changing course. And I have no doubt that globally it will have impact on the acceptance and integration of the new diagnostic opportunities given by the new technology.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor, and I have been pleased to have you with us. And thank you from all the audience and from all the people who are planning to watch in the YouTube channel. We appreciate and thanks for all the audience and looking one day very soon to meet you in person, sir.
Indeed. Thank you very much for having me and lending your ears to me.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for the audience. And see you soon in another webinar. Goodbye.
Okay. Have a good evening. Okay. Bye-bye.